Greetings. We begin by acknowledging that the CSUMB campus sits on unceded Rumsen Ohlone land. I'm Dr. Umi Vaughn, Faculty Director for the Center for Black Student Success. Our center is a hub and home for Black life on campus. We provide some financial support for academic supplies like books, even trips to conferences and such for students. We also have a mentorship program. Additionally, there's opportunities to conduct research alongside Black faculty, and we also present programs like this one to enrich the campus with relevant intellectual ideas, artistic presentations focused around Black culture around the world. Tonight's presentation comes from the Toni Morrison Authors Conversation series. It's fabulous. I'm very excited about our guests. Before we get to this wonderful person, I want to encourage you all to follow CBSS on Instagram. You can find us at csumb.cbss. And so without further ado, I'm going to bring along with us a wonderful author who has written a book called Becoming Black Political Subjects, Movements, and Ethno-Racial Rights in Colombia and Brazil. I'm excited to hear about her trajectory as a scholar, and then we'll all get a chance to ask her some questions at the end. Let's welcome Dr. Tianna Paschel, sociology professor, Africana Studies professor at UC Berkeley. Welcome, Tianna.
Thank you so much, Umi. Professor Vaughn, I should say. First, I just wanted to say thank you for the invitation. So I first met Professor Vaughn probably about 16, 17 years ago in many spaces, but spaces that I think shared our common sort of love for African diasporic music and dance and rhythms. And so it's really nice to see you. Neither of us were professors back then, and now we are. And so I just wanted to first say thank you so much for this invitation to be with you here. And also thank you for all the work that you guys are doing at the center. I also wanted to thank Sonia, Pina, and all of the people whose hands touched anything to make this event possible. There is so much labor that is so invisible, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. So I'd like to start with some slides. I'd like you to look at some pictures, and I want to ask you, what do you think these folks have in common? And so I think the chat is available. So you can put your thoughts in the chat. I want you to see these pictures. And so Sonia, if you could just click through some of them. Good. Thank you. And for some of the younger folks in the audience, you might not know who some of these people are. But for older folks, you might know all of them. All right. And can you just keep it there? So any thoughts on what all of the people in these slides might share? So this is something I like to show my students to start out conversations, because the topic that I'm going to talk about today is, I think, at once when we're talking about Black culture and Black communities within reach, but very far away sometimes in people's minds. So I'm going to go ahead and give the answer to this, which is that everyone that I showed could be understood as Afro-Latin American or Afro-Latino, Afro-Latina, Afro-Latinx. What that means is that everyone that I showed is both of African ancestry and also Latin American and ancestry, both, right? And many of them are people who I like to say faded into Black, faded into African Americanness, especially folks like Sammy Davis Jr. and others who had beautiful careers in the United States, but very rarely get understood as Afro-Latino. So who are Afro-Latinos? What is Afro-Latin America? Why should we be thinking about Blackness in Latin America? So I like to talk about that with you today, and then I'll get to the part of my work, which is really to look at Black protests, Black resistance in this context. But first, I want to back up and say a little bit about who Black folks are in Latin America. So if we could go to the next slide after Cardi B and Amara La Negra. Thank you so much, Sonia. So some of you may know that Latin America and the Caribbean is a real interesting place to think about Black culture, Black protests, to think about Blackness and anti-Blackness. Only 5%, and that's a conservative figure, only 5% or less of the enslaved Africans that were brought against their will to the New World came to the United States. The rest, 95%, went to the Caribbean, Central America, and South America. And so we know that the economies and colonial societies of places like Cuba, Brazil, Jamaica, but also lesser known places like Peru and Mexico were heavily dependent on the work, the labor of Africans, of enslaved Africans. And in many countries in Latin America in particular, those enslaved populations greatly outnumbered the free white populations through much of the colonial period. And even today, conservative estimates of the Black population in this region is 25%. And activists would say it's actually higher. So 1 in every 4 Latin American and Caribbean people are Afro-descendant. Okay. All right. So next slide, please. And we see that that means that there are Black folks in countries that we might already associate with Blackness, right? So anybody who has traveled to places like Cuba or the Dominican Republic or to Brazil, or I would probably say just watched a national baseball game, may know that there are Black folks in these countries. But I like to put this map up because I just want to say that it's also the case that there are Black folks throughout the region and not only those places. There are a number of countries where half or more of the population identifies as Afro-descendant, but then there are other places where there are percentages of the population that look like Black populations here in the United States, so 12%. There are many countries in Latin America where the population of Black folks is about what it is in the United States in terms of percentage. So places like Colombia, where I do my work, but also in Ecuador and others. Okay, next slide, please. And it's widely known that outside of Nigeria, Brazil has the largest number of Black people people who identify as Black. But I think it's lesser known these other cases that I was talking about, places like Colombia, which has the next largest Black population in the Western Hemisphere after the United States, after Brazil and the United States. But more often than not, the people that we associate with these countries are the Shakiras and the Sofia Vergaras of the world. So some of you, if you watched Modern Family, you might recognize the person on the left there. And we see them much more than the Black girls that are surrounding Shakira, which are from her native Colombia and from the Caribbean coast, where she's from, a region that is heavily, heavily Black. Continue. So some of the distinguishing features of thinking about Blackness, Black populations, and Black history in this region has to do with the unique sort of colonial histories of these places. So unlike the United States, where colonists were seeking like religious or seeking some version of freedom from religious persecution and came typically with families intact. This was not the case in much of the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. Instead, in the colonial period, the colonists largely came as single Spanish and Portuguese men. And what that meant was that there was a larger amount of mixing and a larger amount of coerced sort of sexual encounters between the Spanish and Portuguese men and their indigenous and African concubines usually. There are also these large rates of manumission. So unlike in the United States, if we think about the slaveocracy, the slavery, you don't typically have these large rates of people basically buying their way out of slavery. So there are a number of reasons why this happens in Latin America, including the fact that there were systems in place where enslaved people could work sometimes one day out of the week for wages, and they would save up those wages. There were also all kinds of free mutual aid societies where communities would save up money so that folks so folks could get free, right? We also see these these cultural traditions that emerge in the region that are necessarily mixed, right? Spanish, indigenous, and African cultural traditions that rise up. And another sort of aspect that sort of makes this region a bit different from thinking about Black culture and Black struggle in the United States is that for the most part, and in most of Latin America, the Caribbean, you don't see a formal Jim Crow explicitly racist laws, right? That is not to say that there wasn't explicit racism or that white and mestizo citizens didn't use the law to their advantage, but it means that it was not Jim Crow formally. And so that changes some dynamics of how we are to think about how Black people moved, especially post-abolition in these countries. And I think one of the most important aspects of this region is to think about how elites, how people in power thought about Blackness, how they thought about indigeneity. And one of the sort of ideas or the narratives of these nations was this idea of mestizaje. At some point, the elites in Latin America realized that the countries were never going to be Europe, they were never going to be white, and they had to sort of deal with the reality that in many cases, they were countries that were significantly indigenous, significantly Black, and they had to contend with that fact. They had to contend with the fact that their families were mixed in many cases. And so they came up with an ideology called mestizaje, or this ideology that celebrated mixture, even while they acknowledged that they should be moving towards whiteness, right? So some Blackness, some indigeneity is fine. Better in the past than in the future, but it was able to contain some of that. And so this is why we see in countries like Brazil, the celebrations of food, of music, of every cultural thing you could imagine, including language, have so much African influence because of the fact of so many Africans contributing to those cultures, but also the ways that people in power embraced it in some ways, okay? In some ways. Next slide, please. But the fact was that despite all of this celebration, anti-Blackness persisted, just like it does, I would argue, around the globe. And so we see all kinds of anti-Blackness manifest in a couple ways. So I'll just say a couple of things about how we see anti-Blackness manifest in this region. And some of this will be familiar and some of this might be shocking to some of you. So I just want to put that trigger warning out there. So for the first kind of way that we see this are these deep cultures of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness pervades all kinds of cultural life in the region. On the left here is this film from the Dominican Republic called Ugly by Day, Handsome by Night. The picture is kind of small, but you can see that the daytime actor is of course Black and the nighttime actor is white. You can fill in all kinds of things there, understand what they're doing. The one on the bottom is El Negro Mama, or El Negro Mama, which is a Peruvian whiter mestizo man in blackface. And he was on primetime television every week until very recently. And mostly because of Black activists rising up and saying that it was racist. And on the right at the top are the finalists for a beauty pageant. And I'll often ask my students like where they think this beauty pageant is. But I'll just tell you, the beauty pageant is in the blackest states in one of the blackest countries in the world, which is Brazil. These are the winners of the beauty pageants, like the local beauty pageants in the state of Bahia, which has the largest number of Afro-descendants in Brazil. Again, a country that has the largest number of Afro-descendants outside of Nigeria. So my point here is just that anti-Blackness is everywhere. It's on television. It's in regular, everyday language, print media, the ways people raise their children. Sociologist Elizabeth Horch Freeman has this amazing book that is called The Color of Love, where she shows how being a darker skinned child in Brazil can often mean less affection, less attention, less investments in education, that families are making really hard calculations about which of their children have a better chance at success. And unfortunately, that is around color lines. Next slide, please. And very similar to the United States, throughout Latin America, and particularly in Colombia and Brazil, where I've lived and I've done a lot of work, we see anti-Black racism also manifest in terms of inequalities, like real legitimate inequalities in terms of economics. So mortality rates, education rates, income, health, and the fact that that Blackness is often criminalized, right? So you see the same kinds of police violence, over-policing in Black neighborhoods. You see the same kind of spatial dynamics where there's certain neighborhoods that are considered already criminalized, no matter what the people in the neighborhoods are actually doing. And that criminalization has a lot to do with it being Black, and people stereotyping not just the people that live there, but the spaces themselves. Next slide, please. So in all of this, one of the things that has made it so hard to kind of talk about anti-Black racism in particular in this region is the fact that that there are these ideas circulating and are very powerful, that this is a mixed race nation, that these are mixed race nations. Everyone has a little Black in them, everyone has a little Indigenous in them, and a little white in them, and that people can possibly distinguish people at all, let alone discriminate against them. So the story went, how could people be racist against Black people if everyone was mixed with a little Black? How could we be racist against Blacks when we have Black members of our family? And when I've done research at every corner, anytime I tell somebody, sometimes including Black folks, but especially people who don't appear to be Black on the face, when I say, oh, I do work on racism against Black folks in Latin America, they'll say, we don't have any of that. You know what? My uncle was Black, or my auntie is Black, or my mom is actually Black. And so it becomes a powerful tool to just say, you know what? We don't have those kind of problems here. That's a US thing. Next slide, please. And so because of this complexity, the Black protests that have happened in Latin America have been very different, and on very, very different sort of, they look different, they come at different times. They do not look like the US Civil Rights Movement or the Black Power movement, but they are there. When I first entered graduate school, a lot of people were writing books, and a lot of the books they were writing was about absence. Like, there is no Black movement in these countries. People don't really even know that they're Black. And part of what I wanted to do was say, well, I don't know. I don't think that that's the case, because I had spent time in Costa Rica and I spent time in Brazil. And when I would say I was from the Bay Area, or that I was living in the Bay Area, the first thing some people would say was like, oh, they would connect to the Black culture here, African-American culture, and they would also connect with the Black Panther Party and the history of the Black Panther Party here. And so I knew that there was something else going on. Click next slide, please. And so when I started to do work, I started to see that actually there's long traditions of Black social movements, of Black protests, of people organizing for more dignity, for more humanity, and organizing in these different ways. And so my work is in that tradition of saying, let's look at these histories and presence, and let's think about the ways that Black people have come together and come together and struggle over many, many, many years. Next slide, please. And we know that that goes back to these long traditions of runaway slaves, of maroons, of Latin American countries have some of the oldest maroon communities in the hemisphere. And we know in places like San Basilio de Palenque that people still speak African-based languages, Bantu-based languages in particular. And we see that throughout the region, that there's these long traditions of maroon resistance. Continue, please. And we also know that it was like live and popping in like the 19th century in cities like Montevideo in Uruguay, in Havana in Cuba, Sao Paulo in Brazil, and in Buenos Aires in Argentina. There was a vibrant Afro-Latin American press. There were social clubs that were meant to counteract the barriers to Black folks in those periods. There were political parties in a number of places. There were newspapers and really a Black social sphere and a Black political sphere in these countries. Some of these were short-lived because they were repressed violently in some cases, but they existed, and we have to acknowledge that they did. Continue, please. And the research that I see my work as part of also is research where we are starting to look at the successes of these movements. They have been pushing the government to change things and to bring about all kinds of reforms, including affirmative action in universities, but also all kinds of laws that celebrate and acknowledge Black culture, right, on various scales, but also land rights, collective land rights, which I can say a little bit more about later. Next slide, please. I think the final area I just want to say is really important as we think about the Black communities of Latin America is the rich cultural traditions that many have written about, including Professor Vaughn. But one of the things I would like to say is that a lot of these cultural producers are really political and have done so much work, not just in showing the resilience of the people through culture, but in saying and demanding rights through their music and bringing people together and allowing for folks to really understand themselves as part of collectives, that basic step that's really important to protest and to social change. Okay, next slides. So I just wanted to show a couple of slides that are of the protests so that you can see the movements, the mobilization that has been happening over the last couple of decades, mobilization around the census. Next slide, please. Black women's organizations mobilizing. That's the March of Black Women that was held in Brazil, in the capital. Next slide. We have all kinds of protests around education, around different things. Continue. This is just me. I was involved in like a lot of things when I was in the field, and this is just a picture of me taking a little time for rest and respite. And it's at ILEAE, which is a cultural organization that I see as part of the political movements that I study. This here is an Afro-Colombian protest. Continue, please. And this here is another protest in the Cauca region of Colombia, where I do a lot of my work. And the sign says, "For the defense and the permanency of the territory of the community, the Afro-descendant community of Yolombo," which is a community I visited quite a bit. And it says, "Presente, presente, presente." We are here, we are here, we are here. And you can see children are participating. These are movements that are for the rights to stay on land that they've occupied for hundreds and hundreds of years, lands that their ancestors came to do mining on, to do farming on, and lands that the government and all kinds of corporations have been trying to displace them from, to push them off of the land. And so they've been fighting to stay on the land, to be able to live the ways that they've been living for many years. Okay. This is Francia Marquez Mina, who is a dear friend of mine who's actually running for president of Colombia. She's a pre-candidate, and she's one of the most powerful leaders in this community. And there's quite a few documentaries on her and how she went from being part of this mining, farming community to getting a law degree and becoming a real force, not just in Colombia, but in the kind of global environmental struggle. So I'll just end by saying that some of these rights look like cultural recognition. Some of them look like Black History days, weeks, and months. Some of them look like collective Black land. There are ethnic education. There's also affirmative action. So these are the things that I study. So last slide I wanted to show is just of what my book tries to do. So my book is asking, why is it that the Colombian and Brazilian governments basically started to recognize Black rights in these countries? The second question I ask is, what kind of Black political subject gets institutionalized? That's a fancy way of saying, like, what does it mean to be in the law? Like, who gets included in that law and who it doesn't? And then finally, like, what happens once you get rights, right? Like, now that they have Black rights in terms of land, in terms of education, does it change anything in people's everyday lives? So if Professor Vaughn allows me to, I would like to show you a video of an Afro-Colombian group that I see as central to this movement and to really getting people in the community aware of Black culture and excited about mobilization. And they have been around for a while, and they, are like, get nominated for Latin Grammys and that kind of thing. But I think one of the amazing things is that when I was doing field research in Colombia, they would be just at all kinds of parties, and they were so humble, and probably still are. But they just have been really, really important in making the struggles really visible, both in Colombia and also internationally. So I'm gonna thank you, Sonia, for queuing that up. So it's just, I think, like 3 minutes or 4 minutes.
De donde vengo yo, la cosa no es fácil, pero siempre igual sobrevivimos. Vengo yo, de tanto luchar, siempre con la nuestra nos salimos. Vengo yo, y aquí se habla mal, pero todo está mucho mejor. Vengo yo, tenemos la lluvia, el frío, el calor. De la zona de los rapis, mami, papi, tenemos problemas, pero andamos happy en comparsa. También bailamos salsa y bajamos el río en balsa. El calor se siente y no hay problema para tomarse su botella de aguardiente. Hace el día esté soleado, te la pasas en Guayabao. Todo el mundo toma whisky, ajá. Todo el mundo anda en moto, ajá. Todo el mundo tiene carro, ajá. Menos nosotros, ajá. Todo el mundo come pollo, ajá. Todo el mundo está embambado, ajá. Todo el mundo quiere irse de aquí, pero ninguno lo ha logrado. De donde vengo yo, la cosa no es fácil, pero siempre igual sobrevivimos. Vengo yo, de tanto luchar, siempre con la nuestra nos salimos. Vengo yo, y aquí se habla mal, pero todo está mucho mejor. Vengo yo, tenemos la lluvia, el frío, el calor.
De donde vengo yo, sí mi señor, se vayan verbena con gorra y con short, con raros peinados o con extensión. Critíquenme a mí o lo critico yo. Si tomo cerveza no tengo el botín, y si tomo whisky hay chavo y blin blin, y si tengo oro en el cuello colgado, ay, 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 es porque estoy montado.
Todo el mundo toma whisky, ajá. Todo el mundo anda en moto, ajá. Todo el mundo tiene tiene carro, ajá, menos nosotros, ajá, todo el mundo come pollo, ajá, todo el mundo está embambado, ajá, todo el mundo quiere irse de aquí, ajá, pero ninguno lo ha logrado. De donde vengo yo, la cosa no es fácil, pero siempre igual sobrevivimos. Vengo yo, de tanto luchar, siempre con la nuestra nos salimos. Vengo yo, y aquí se habla mal, pero todo está mucho mejor. Vengo yo, tenemos la lluvia, el frío, el calor. Acá tomamos agua de coco, lavamos en moto. Todo el que no tiene anda en rapimoto. Carretera de esta pa' viajar. No hay plata pa' comer, pero sí pa' chupar. Característica general, alegría total, invisibilidad nacional e internacional. Autodiscriminación sin razón, racismo inminente, mucha corrupción. Monte Culebra, máquina de guerra, desplazamiento por intereses en la tierra, subienda de pescado, agua por todos lados, cerveza que ni el Discovery ha explotado. Pero minas llenas de oro y platino, yo, reyes en la biodiversidad, chinche entre todos los vecinos, y en deporte ni hablar. De donde vengo yo, la cosa no es fácil, pero siempre igual sobrevivimos. Vengo yo, de tanto luchar, siempre con la nuestra nos salimos. Vengo yo, y aquí se habla mal, pero todo está mucho mejor. Vengo yo, tenemos la lluvia, el frío, el calor. Chayo, condoto, divina, ajá, la quinta, San Pedro, te quita el disfraz. Chayo, condoto, divina, ajá, la quinta, San Pedro, te quita el disfraz. Chayo, condoto, divina, ajá, la quinta, San Pedro, te quita el disfraz. Chayo, condoto, divina, ajá, la quinta, San Pedro, te quita. De donde vengo yo, la cosa no es fácil, pero siempre igual sobrevivimos. Vengo yo, de tanto luchar, siempre con la nuestra nos salimos. Vengo yo, y aquí se habla mal, pero todo está mucho mejor. Vengo yo, tenemos la lluvia, el frío, el calor.
Vamos a golpearlo, aquí traemos todo el repertorio que es.
That's my favorite part.
Yeah. So, Tianna, tell us just a little bit about what that song is saying. Where It Come From is the name of the title, and what more were they saying about that place?
Thank you. So where they come from is a region in Colombia that is on the Pacific northern coast called the Choco. More than 85% of people identify as Black in that region. And it is a place of a lot of concentrated poverty. It is a place that is sort of understood as with all kinds of stereotypes, right? As a region that is lacking, that lacks. And what they're saying in that song is, we don't have much, but we are powerful. We are joyous. We do have joy. We have so many things that they want to deny us. So where I come from, things aren't easy, but we still survive. Where I come from, people try to leave, but never quite can. Where I come from is a place that has music and culture and all these things. And, you know, everyone else in the country is eating well, and we're not, right? But we are surviving. And so it's about resilience. It's about survival.
The movie's over.
Thank you. You can watch another movie, sweetheart. I have my 6-year-old with me. Okay. You don't have to ask me anymore, Marshawn. You can close the door, my love. Okay. Sorry about that.
So the things that are being sung about in that music resonate with a lot of Black spaces around the United States and around the globe, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I want to start off with a question. There's a few from the audience that we'll get into as well, but I would like to hear from you about some of the big political achievements, you know, by Black communities, Black activists in Colombia and Brazil, that some of them that you mentioned in your book. And I want to hear about kind of current challenges to those earlier achievements.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Vaughn. And I'm going to try to give you all of your flowers and titles, but it's going to be hard because I know you as a phenomenal drummer and singer and dancer and photographer, but pre-doctor, you know. So thank you so much for that question. So, you know, some of the things that they have really achieved have been pretty amazing. And that was part of the reason why I was drawn to the region. I was drawn to the region for a lot of reasons. So I'm from Flint, Michigan originally, and I moved to Sacramento when I was like 6 years old. And I remember as a little girl seeing how different it was here in California compared to Michigan. I think the main thing that I noticed was just that so many of my friends, when I came to school here, spoke Spanish. And so I was like really drawn to the language of Spanish early on. And so I studied abroad in Costa Rica when I was in college, and then I went to Brazil. So I did like a semester in Costa Rica and a semester in Brazil. And in both contexts, I remember being blown away by the fact that every single person I encountered assumed I was from those places. So we had this big group of folks. People were from Mexico, like parents were from Mexico, from everywhere. And somehow it was only the 3 Black women in the group where people are like, oh, you're from Costa Rica, clearly. We'd be like, what? You're from this place, clearly. Like, and we were like, well, yo, you got to go to the coast. You got to go to the coast. You know, that's always the answer. If you want to find Black folks in Latin America, go to the coast. And so I had been really drawn to the region since I would say like college or even before college. And I was really drawn to the African presence, the Black presence in the region. But one of the things that I learned after college, working in like policy law institutes in a think tank in DC, was really that Black movements were live and fighting in a time where in the United States, we were sort of riding out the like civil rights, you know, generation kind of things. Like Obama actually got elected while I was doing field work. And so there was this sense in that time, you know, I don't know that Black folks necessarily believe this, but like there was hope. Like, you know, there was like post-racial talk. And I think among Black folks, it wasn't necessarily post-racial, but like things might be shifting, right? There wasn't as much agitation happening in that time. And that was exactly the time where Black activists throughout Latin America, the Caribbean, were risking their lives to fight for rights. And it was exciting and powerful. And I was drawn to that, right? And in that, Brazil and Colombia were references. They were places where they had really achieved things. And not just to my like eye, but like throughout the region. Like, so folks in Ecuador, folks in Venezuela, folks everywhere were looking to these places because they had achieved things. So like, so what had they achieved? So they achieved constitutional recognition. A lot of people would think about this as reparations. Some activists talk about it this way, but one of the things that they achieved was collective land rights. And we're not talking like 40 acres, actually. We're talking like, if you could imagine, given the Black populations of these countries and given the magnitude of like maroon communities, the magnitude of people who were making claims to land rights, in Colombia, a fourth of the country is now under collective ethnic rights. So a fourth of the land of the country is either under collective indigenous land rights or collective Black land rights. A real revolutionary thing, you know? So I was drawn to looking at that, looking at how escaped enslaved people were getting the rights to the territory that they had lived on and fought for for centuries in some cases, but certainly decades. And then they were getting rights to enter into the university, right? So despite Brazil being half Afro-descendant country, you know, the figures, I can't remember them, but like we're in the low, like not even 10% of the university population, like somewhere like 2-3% of the university population in that country was Black. And so they got the right to enter into the university under these quota systems. I was interested in that. I was interested in all the cultural things too, right? the telling of Black history and Black culture at every level of the universe, or every level of education, from primary school all the way up to college. In Brazil in particular, this was really powerful because activists had decided, you know what, they're never going to tell Black history and African history in this country. And so they had set up schools since at least the 70s, and arguably before that, just in communities. They go to poor Black communities and they would set up schools that would teach African history. And so what happens with these rights is that they started to say, you know what, we can do this, but the government should be doing this, because this is actually the story of Brazilians. This is not the story of just Black Brazilians. This is Brazilian history. And so they were able to get that mandated. And I remember one time I was in Brazil, next to the house of the family that was my host family back in the day, who I'm still in contact with. I'm like still their American daughter. I was hanging out. I was like, in my 30s at this point. And I heard this play going on next door. And I go out to to the veranda, and I go and I look at this play that's happening. And it is a play about maroon escape runaway slave leader Zumbi dos Palmares. And they are acting out this whole play about his life in society. And the kicker to this is that this is a senior citizen home. It is not even a formal school, but because of the legal changes they saw, and because they offer educational programming to senior citizens, they were under the law, and they also took it very seriously, that this is a time where we are actually supposed to be learning about African history, about Black history here, and we're gonna teach ourselves about it. And it was really beautiful, and I really thought, like, wow, the reach of some of these laws is really like beyond even my comprehension.
Yeah. So, for example, I know that just like we passed through in a way in the United States with our last president, Brazil has a conservative president, and there seems to be some kind of pushback on some of the progress achieved in Brazil. How about that? Do you see that being the case?
Yeah, it is. I like to tell the positive stories about this, and it's a little sad sometimes, right? Like when you really look at the reality. I mean, when my book was going to press in 2016, the political parties that had brought about a lot of the laws in the context of Brazil specifically had been completely overturned, or they had been kicked out of office in legal ways and some kind of shady ways too, right? And so I do remember being like in the car, and it's really rare that Brazil makes it to the news. Things have to be really, really egregious for us to care, in our US media. And so that the situation was bad. So there was an interim government, and they, announced on NPR, like, 5 ministries at the national level, right, are going to be shut down starting tomorrow in Brazil. And all I thought, and my book was literally going to press that day, I was like, oh, I know the Ministry for Racial Equality, which is the ministry that was responsible for looking and making sure these laws were going to be implemented, was on the chopping block. I knew it. I knew that. I knew the Ministry for Women would be on the chopping block. I knew that all of that would be, and sure enough, it was. And so, there has been a lot of rolling back of some of this, and specifically like land rights and other things, right? But one of the things I do like to say, and not just because I find it encouraging, but you can't roll back people's consciousness. You can't be like, oops, psych, nope. People are gonna, all the awakenings that have happened amongst the people, and not just Black people. I think that there's been awakenings more broadly. The fact that Francia Marquez is a real viable presidential candidate in a country that is probably 10% Black says a lot. She's a woman who identifies as a Black feminist, as a campesina, as a kind of farmer peasant, you know what I mean? And she was a teenage mother, she's a presidential candidate. And so I think what that suggests is you could roll back all kinds of things, but you can't roll back people's consciousness. When people get woke, you ain't gonna easily put them back to sleep, you know?
Yeah. So I want to segue to a question from the audience, and I want to do so by speaking about the role of language in the discourse of race in the United States, but first in Latin America, Afro-Latin America. From my experience in Cuba and Puerto Rico, Colombia, Brazil, I know that there's a range of terminology that people use, play with, weaponize, even in discussions of race. And so I want you to talk first about how language and race works in Colombia and Brazil. What do people like to be called? The polite moreno, or Ilaye says, a preferencia ser llamado de negão, né? So, you know, what are some of the differences of language in Colombia and Brazil around race, please?
Yeah, that is like a never-ending question within these communities and movements, and even within the law. Imagine, you know, I mean, even in the context of the United States, right? Like, I'm thinking of a Talib Kweli song, like that chart, like, talks about all the different things that we've been called over time, even just legal definitions, let alone slurs and everything else, or things that we have come to kind of re-articulate and make our own and call ourselves, right? So the practice, the politics of naming is always a thing for anybody in any collectivity, right? And that is also the same in Colombia and Brazil. So part of the reason why I was saying Afro-descendant a lot in my remarks was to sort of avoid some of the complexity, right? But since you've asked, I will say a little bit about that. So Afro-descendant is this term that like arises, I mean, it arises in different places at different times, but Afro-descendiente becomes this term that a lot of, especially like internationally connected Black activists start to use in like 2001. And it becomes this way of trying to deal with the fact that just like African Americans, people of African descent in Latin America and the Caribbean are also mixed with European ancestry, are mixed with indigenous ancestry. And so there's like a great deal of categories in between white and Black, in between white and indigenous, in between Black and indigenous, that one has to kind of understand, like, where they fit into all of this, right? And so one of the decisions that Black activists in Brazil in particular decided to make is to say, and this was based on statistics, right? They found that there were social scientists, sociologists who were like, look, I know that you guys think that mulattoes, right? People who are of like Portuguese, in that case, in Portuguese and of African ancestry, pardos, mixed race people, are supposedly moving towards whiteness and doing better. But when you look at educational outcomes, when you look at even things like residential segregation, they're not doing that much better. They don't make that much more money. And so really what we need to do is mobilize them too. And that we shouldn't have a difference. And the term negro is exactly that. So it is a combination of preto and pardo. It is to say that we are all under one umbrella and we're all, you know, people of African descent, basically, and that we need to be in struggle together, right? And so there are many terms that people use. I would say that term is the one that that sort of emerges and becomes the most powerful in the movement over the last 40, 50 years in Brazil. And in Colombia, it's interesting. It's complicated too, right? Because you have rural movements that are much more likely to say that we are Black communities. They have a collective sense of, they don't talk about Black people, they talk about Black communities. It's always collective. Their politics are collectivist, right? If you go to, you know, on your boat to one of the like riverine communities that are like 100% Black on the Pacific coast of Colombia in particular, you get there, you get off the boat, you say, hi, what's up? They'll say, how are we doing? How are we doing? ¿Cómo vamos? Like, it's never like, ¿cómo estás? Like, how are you doing? Or how am I doing? It's like, how are we doing, right? And so their politics are like that. So they more often than not think about things as like Black communities, right? And in the cities, they have more of a like individualist politics in a way. And they like to talk about like Afro-Colombian people. They like to talk about themselves in a different way. And for a lot of them, they see the term negro as offensive, the term Black as offensive. And so Afro-Colombian becomes a more powerful word for them because it isn't in the lexicon and every day. No one is going to yell a racial slur at you and call you an Afro-Colombian. They're probably going to call you some version of negro. And so, you know, I think to think about Blackness and anti-Blackness, one of the things I like to think about is like, what does that contain? What is supposed to be in that category? Like, like what meanings do we put in there? And what meanings could we put in there? And like, you know what I'm saying? Like, and so to think about like when people use a word, when they use that word, what does it mean? Like, you know, I've had people in the context of the United States call me Black and be like, oh, I mean African American. And to me, I'm like, call me Black, right? Like first, just call me Black. But also, if you call me Black and you think and you don't have a idea of Black as inferior, as bad, then we're good. Like you could call me anything and I will feel like the meanings that you're associating with that thing by how you're saying it and what you're saying to me. Like the word isn't as important as like what you're thinking that word represents. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the particular question that was coming from the audience, you kind of touched on it now. Here in the U.S. context, we have the N-word. And, you know, there's a range of kind of meanings associated with it. You could have Pulitzer Award winner like Kendrick spitting wisdom laced heavily with the N-word. Or you can, you know, I had the experience of meeting Assata Shakur on the dance floor in Cuba and having dinner with her, and her saying that people shouldn't use the word and that you would never understand it till it's been kind of spit on you by a police officer stomping you down. Right? So how does the N-word, kind of the American context of it, sit or resonate in Afro-Latin America? And, you know, to play with us some more around that word.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's interesting. I don't know that there is an equivalent.
Yeah.
I do think that anti-Blackness is so just so like oozing out of so much of the culture of these places that even just saying the standard word Black already often comes with so many negative connotations that they don't need an N-word beyond that, honestly. And it comes usually with adjectives in front of it that let you understand what exactly it means, right? I think, you know, a version of like what Kendrick Lamar is doing and what many of us do, like outside of these formal spaces, which is to use words like the N-word in a way that is familial, in a way that gives emphasis to things that might not otherwise be able to be emphasized, right, without the use of it. That kind of way of using language and naming oneself with a word that has had a history that is so interlinked, as Assata, I think, rightfully put, with anti-Black violence. I think a version of that is the use of preto, at least in the context of Brazil, right? Like, so a lot of people basically have sort of reappropriated that word to say, you know what, the word preto, which is like typically in the past has been reserved for the darkest of Black folks, right? It is the word Black, and it is the one where there are some, you know, there are expressions about it, like there are negative like slurs and stuff related to it, and all kinds of sayings about that you could only imagine. I'm like, I don't want to be like, but I don't want to say all the things, but you can imagine stereotypes around laziness, around not being smart, about being dirty, all those kinds of things that are just part of the language every day, about bad hair, about this, you know. But that word has been kind of reimagined and taken and snatched and like and used as an affirmative word by even light-skinned people of African descent, right? So preta Gil, and like just like people just being like, I'm just gonna say it, preto, 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 like so preta, like, you know, I'm gonna call you like pretão, pretona, you know, like just to like sort of like offend the senses, really, to be like, when you hear that word, you know, you hear it with rage, you hear it with all the negative connotations, and you think of it as something we should be running from. But to say, no, I'm going to call myself preta, and like somebody of my color calling themselves preta is sort of already revolutionary, right? Because I'm supposed to be moving away from that category. Certainly my kids are supposed to definitely be lighter than me. And like, we're supposed to be on our way to something that looks like whiteness. Like if not this next generation, certainly in the next. So to be like, no, I'm staying back here in the like pretona like category, and you ain't about to move me from here is really, really revolutionary in certain ways, given the messages about like doing better is being whiter, you know, in Brazil and in most places.
Yeah. Wow. Thank you for that response. Another thing that I overheard people sometimes shouting or conversing in Brazil was "As vidas negras importam," Black Lives Matter, like in translation, but they were kind of dealing with that concept. I wonder, have in Colombia or Brazil, you have any notion of how people are reacting to that movement?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I mean, it's absolutely the case that that the movement for Black lives in the United States, just like many of its predecessors, has inspired movements all over the place. That's like unquestionable. Like, and if we were to sort of look into certain corners of Brazilian communities and politics in the 1970s, we would find the same thing with the Black Power movement. If we were to look in the 1960s, we would find similar inspiration, the US Civil Rights Movement. We would also find that the movement to decolonize the African continent, like also that folks were knowledgeable about and inspired by those movements. And so Black politics, of course, doesn't have like nation state boundaries, just like politics more generally doesn't. And so I see that as just part of politics, right? So that's happening for sure. And folks see, and, you know, not just Black people, struggles all over the world, right? You see this in like East Asia, Southeast Asia, folks talking about Black Lives Matters and like being inspired by those movements and thinking about the marginalized in these capacious ways. That's happening. So one of the things that I do want to say about that is that what I think often happens if we see those utterances, which are real and come from a real place, is that I think sometimes we can confuse those with like this idea that Black politics is flowing in one direction from the North to the South, that any movement that's happening in a place like Brazil is an extension of, or necessarily just like flowing from or inspired by Black movements in the United States. And I think that it goes both ways first. And one of our mutual friends, Amilcar Pereira, who's a Afro-Brazilian historian, talks about this in his work. His dad was part of movements in the 70s, especially in 80s, but like how the US African-American press was like, you know, at the turn of the 20th century was looking at Brazil because Brazil had a Black political party, something we've never had in the United States. And so the flow goes both ways. And when reporters sometimes come to me, and I know this is not your question, but reporters will say, can you tell me about Black Lives Matter in Brazil? And I'll say, no, I'm going to talk to you about like React or Die movement, which is a movement against, state violence, against police violence that started many years before Black Lives Matter. So I'm going to talk to you about them. And I'm going to talk to you about all the movements that, you know, started before Black Lives Matter, right?
Yeah. So I want to ask you just one or two more questions. You've blessed us with so much information already. You have a concept in your book that you call political field alignments. Just now that you mentioned movements and organizations, can you talk a little bit about that concept of political field alignments and what that means?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing out the most boring concept from my book to discuss. I appreciate that, Dr. Vaughn. I'm just joking. I mean, I'm a sociologist by training, and like, you know, the literature, the scholarship in that area is trying to think about why and how movements like succeed. Like how do people without much power change a power structure, you know? And in this case, in the form of a law or a series of laws that are intended to better the lives of Black people, people um, who have little economic power and little political power, and people who, for many, many decades, were thought to like not have any particular struggles of their own necessarily, other than, you know, maybe their Blackness being a problem, right? But like that there's no racism to speak of, there's no discrimination, there's no, you know, if anything, they're poor live over in that region, not thinking about, oh, well, that region has been made to be poor, historically divested from the central government, all those things, right? So how do those people get together and somehow change the law, you know? And so I come up with this term political field alignment to kind of understand that, because, you know, movements, the real moment in which these rights start to get on the books, right, is like in the late 1980s with the constitutional reform in Brazil, in the 90s especially, and then in 2000s. Like that's when it starts to like light up across the whole region. But that's not the moment that they started organizing. Like I said before, there were Black political parties in the 20s and 30s. There were movements in the 60s and 70s as well, even under military dictatorship. There were movements in the 40s. So there's movements in both countries, in Brazil and Colombia, and across the 20th century. So why is it that the 1980s happens and the 1990s happen? Like, what is it about that particular period where they actually get like reparations, kind of, right, in some form? How did that happen? And so what I argue is that these struggles that have been going on for some time really like catch wind in these international dynamics that are happening, right? Yeah. So first, it's like the United Nations starts getting involved in and interested in multicultural reforms. And I see in the chat someone talking about indigenous communities and indigenous politics. So indigenous communities are organizing pan-indigenous struggles across the hemisphere. They are pushing institutions like the UN, like the International Labor Organization, to change their colorblind policies, because these colorblind policies are hurting indigenous communities and hurting Black communities. And so they make these pushes. And so those international community organizations like the UN start talking, right, to people in power, saying like, what are your rights around multiculturalism? What are you know, this is also a time where new constitutions are happening, dictatorships are falling in the region, and they are asking new questions about who they want to be. What does democracy look like in this region, right? And so I say that there's an alignment, because what I'm arguing is that at the national level, there are these openings, right? Constitutional reforms are happening. Folks are like hustling to try to figure out like what a modern political community looks like in Brazil after all these years of dictatorship. They're thinking the same thing in Colombia, for reasons of like, they're getting out of this whole period of like, or they're trying to get out of, and still trying to get out of this period of like just warfare, right? Internal conflict, guerrilla forces, all of this stuff that's going on. So they're trying to like bring guerrilla fighters back into the fold, right? So all of this stuff is happening at the national level, and then internationally, these institutions are starting to be like, this is the new phase of democracy. It must be multicultural. It must recognize things like indigenous rights. And so when I say political field alignment, I'm talking about those things lining up at a same time and place, and really catapulting struggles that have been shunned before, right? Like to the center of politics, right? These are people like folks like Michael Hanchard, who's a political scientist who did work on Black movements before, and who's shoulders I stand on in many ways. When he was interviewing the same people I interviewed, he interviewed them before this alignment happened. They were like in basements somewhere, like with bullhorns and like shouting at people and being like, you're Black, there's racism here. And like people just didn't care. Like, you know what I mean? Like people laughed at the activists in my book. And by the time I started doing work here, which is like early 2000s, they have changed the game completely, right? And so part of my work is trying to figure out how it is that happens.
You mentioned in the book, and I think it was our sister Francia Marquez who led this women's march from Yolombo on the Pacific coast, in the Valle region, to Bogota to talk about Afro-Colombian land rights, and for which she won the Goldman Prize in San Francisco. It's like the Nobel Peace Prize, but for kind of nature, kind of saving stuff, or the environmental justice causes.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you how music and dance fits into politics, because you say in your book that their march included drums, included chants and songs, etc. So how does music and dance fit into politics as you see it?
Yeah, I think it's crucial. I think some of the old school political scientists who had written about Black struggle in Latin America made arguments that like that wasn't the space for any kind of politics that could shift anything. And I think that they did that kind of sincerely. Like, I don't think that they were just haters about culture. I think that they thought that in regions where, especially a place like Brazil, where that acknowledges samba as the national music, right, and national dance of the country, and like distinctly African-based and like African-centered and very African cultural form, to say like this is our national culture. It's not shunned. It is national culture. To say that like our national dish is going to be an African-based national dish that has an African name. You know what I mean? Like that we are going to be doing all of these things so people who were writing about this were basically saying, you know what, given that culture could get co-opted by the government, and that most Brazilians will just take that culture and wrap it back into the flag of Brazil and be like, oh, we're all mixed clearly, and there's no problem here. A lot of people were skeptical about like what culture could do in terms of these movements.
Yes.
And I have found that like, that's maybe that is a phenomenon. And also I think the movements have clarity. Like they have clarity around the need to feed their souls through the culture. They have clarity around the ways that like the culture itself can feed the movements, right? Like you have spent time in both of these countries and done research on both. And like, that like, there is no march of any kind, one that doesn't have drums, that doesn't have singing, but there is also not one without an after party. There's not one that doesn't have like folks like it's 3 a.m. and it's still going, and like, now they're cooking some kind of delicious fish soup situation. Like, like folks are just definitely like, it's just, right? Batucada, people come out the woodworks and know how to play instruments, like it's just so embedded in the political struggle and into the culture that like, there's just no need to separate it out. And I do see it as political. Like they are doing things that their ancestors did to survive. And it is a mode of survival already. And it's a miracle that they can still do those things, that they still remember those songs and still do that. Even in the constitutional reform processes, like in Colombia in particular, they did serenades, right? Like they brought like these humongous xylophones like from the Pacific coast to play and do these serenatas so that they can show the people in power who had never in their lives gone to any of these communities and had no idea what was going on there, to show them like we do have a distinct culture, like we come from a place with a particular culture that you don't even know about. And so it's really, it's very political from the minute you grab an instrument, from the minute you like sing that verse, you know. I think of it as political, and I see even like commercial artists engaging in a politics, like I was mentioning with Choke Keep Town, to say we're of the Pacific, we are Black, and that to be this anthem that everybody sings really does break down some of the regional divisions, even amongst Black folks that you saw before that. And I see that as political work.
Yeah. So as a way to begin to close out, I would like to invite you, Dr. Paschel, to talk to our specific closest audience of Black students at CSU Monterey Bay and give them some advice in terms of becoming political subjects, Black political subjects here in the United States. Should they vote? Should they join organizations? What do you think on that topic for them, for us?
Yeah, so one of the things that I would say to you is that young people make all the change in the world, first of all. Every movement, everywhere, always. And students, young or not, right, have also been at the center of world-shifting things across the globe. Arab Spring, like everything we can imagine. And so I just want to say that, like, y'all have power, first of all, period. And I think the question really is, what do you do with that power? You know, like, it's not a question of like, if you have it or not, you have it. What do you do with that power? You know, sometimes people introduce my work and say, oh, she does work on the Black movement in Colombia or the Black movement in Brazil. And what I always try to correct is to say, I do work on the movements in those places, because even at the level of like a region or a city, there are movements. And what does that tell me, I think, about how one can become political is that these are movements that are, you know, there are like teachers, like Black teachers who are, I'm sorry, there's a feedback, I'm sorry, I'm not sure why, but Black teachers who are organizing around how you teach African history to preschool, kindergarten, K through 3, right? Those are movements that are in my book, right? There are movements of folks who are trying to get their community recognized as a historic, like, maroon community and get land rights for that community. There are so many different movements that make up the Black movement that say, you agitate from your position wherever you are, that we can make change wherever we are. I am a mom and I am a professor in a very elite institution in a very, very rich, resource grabbing country called the United States. And I have power because of that. And also the kinds of things that I can engage with and the kinds of change I can make are specific, right? Like, I can utilize the resources of UC Berkeley to bring people like Francia Marquez to come and to share with us, and so that we can support her work and be inspired by her work, right? I might not always be on the front lines of protests, because now I think about my son, and as a single mom, I think about, like, you know, who will be here for him if I'm not. And so there are these different ways that I act. But vote always vote. That's like hands down. But think about what kind of change you can make in this world. And I wouldn't let anyone tell you, as you think about yourself as a political person in the world, anyone tell you that there's one right way to do that. Right. Because I think that even over a lifetime of anybody, Asada included, that they do that in different ways, in different spaces, and over time, right? I've done anti-racist work in my kids' preschool. You know what I mean? That is something that has to do with my position. Like, I am in a position to make some change in this little space, and I will, right? And so I would just say, agitate, agitate from wherever you are, and know that you have power, and you can use it in many ways, but you have it.
Yes. So We here at the Center for Black Student Success want to thank you with all our hearts. We appreciate the work that you're doing at UC Berkeley. This book, Becoming Black Political Subjects, Movements and Ethno-Racial Rights in Colombia and Brazil. And we know that more books are to come. So we'll be an audience for you always. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you so much, Professor Vaughn. Take care, everybody. Be well.
Yes.
Bye.
So with that, I want to thank all of our audience members, the CBSS family, all the students at CSU Monterey Bay, all of the individuals who are part of the organization of CBSS programs. Thank you, thank you. I want to encourage people to donate. Without help from community members, without people who are wanting our work of increasing retention, increasing enrollment, retention, and a sense of satisfaction and belonging for Black students at CSU Monterey Bay, your donations are helpful towards that end. Also, follow us on Instagram. We have inspirational messages there. We have announcements about upcoming programs, and we would love for you to join us there. For now, good night and be well. Thank you very much.